In this video, we're going to talk about some basic terminology and definitions that you should know and understand before you start using CloudKit. And we're going to start at the very top with a container. So a container is app specific. Like for example, Notes has a container, Photos has a container, DubDubGrub has a container. And if you remember in Xcode, we created our container, right? I'm gonna pull up the screenshot there. You remember checking that little box and we created the container? There you go. So the container is kind of like the big overall container, for lack of a better word, for your app. There's gonna be stuff inside that container that we're gonna talk about next. So within that container, there's three main databases, right? A public, a private, and a shared. And their names do a pretty good job of describing what they'll do, but we'll dive in. So your public database is for things that you want every user of your app to be able to see, right? So the Apple News app is an example, right? You don't want to hide articles. You want everybody to be able to read the articles. The WWDC app, right? When they put up the WWDC videos, we want everybody to see that. In our example, in DubDubGrub, our locations, right? The Chipotles, the Original Joes, those are going to go in the public database because we want all our users to see it. So hopefully you're starting to see the kind of data that you want in the public database. Now for the private database, which I described a little bit in the previous video, but now that is for user-specific data. Again, the Notes app, like all my notes that I'm looking at right now, that is in my private container. My photos are in a private container. And like I mentioned before, all my data as a user of the Notes app in my private container, that goes against my iCloud storage quota, not the apps. Remember we talked about how much data your app could hold? Remember in the private database, that doesn't go against your app, that goes against the specific user's allocation. So that's a good thing to know. And then the big privacy thing with a private database is that even as the developer, like if we had a private database in DubDubGrub, we don't, but pretend we do. You as the user of DubDubGrub, I can't see whatever you put in that private database, even as a developer with my backend, command center that I can see everything. So with private databases, you get the Apple level privacy. So good thing there. And then last, we have the shared database, which is, items that are shared between users. Again, the example of this is the collaborating on a note, right? If you've ever done that with a user, or sometimes you can share a photo album with another iCloud user. So that kind of stuff is in the shared database. So again, the three databases: public, private, shared, and their names do a pretty good job of explaining them. So the next topic is records, and we're going to talk about a record type as well. So our data, right, we're going to have a DDG location. Again, DDG is DubDubGrub, and DDG location is a record type. We're going to declare that record type, and then we're going to give it, properties, right? Just like when you're creating the model in your app, right? You have a DDG location, that's going to have a name, an address, description, like all the stuff that's on our location. So that's record type. And then an actual record is an instance of that type, right? So if DDG location is the record type, then the record would be Chipotle, Original Joe's, Peggy Sue's 50s Diner, whatever, right? All the individual locations are a record of record type DDG location. And you'll see when we build this app, we're going to be constantly, fetching, saving, updating records, right? So records is kind of like the data that gets transferred back and forth. So those records can either live in, your public database, right? Our DDG locations are going to live in our public database. If you had a private record type, that would live in your private database, etc. So records, live within the different databases. Next up, let's talk about a CK reference. So I'm going to pull up the CK record again, and these are all the types of data that you can attach to a record. It's the typical things, right? A string, an array, an asset, which is like an image. But you can also see we can attach a reference. So what a CK reference is a way to connect two records. You basically create a pointer to another record. So the example of that for DubDubGrub is our DDG profile, which we haven't talked about yet. We're going to have that profile object is going to have a reference to a DDG location. And what that represents is the DDG profile is essentially like our user object, but a user is going to be able to check into a location. So the reference from the profile to the location is essentially saying like, this profile is checked into this location. So you use a reference to connect the two. Finally, let's talk about the workhorse of CloudKit, and that is CK operation. These are, to put it simply, kind of like the network calls, like how we're going to communicate and interact with CloudKit, right? This is how we're going to fetch, query, save, delete, that kind of stuff. When we pull down our list of location, that's a CK operation. When we update our profile, that's a CK operation. When we query to see what users are checked into what locations, CK operation. See where I'm going with this? Now there's kind of calling it two types is probably not the correct words to use. So the CK operation is kind of like you get the full power of NS operation, right? You can do a lot of stuff like determine your quality of service. You can do batch fetches, batch updates, that kind of stuff. You can even fetch partial records, which is awesome, right? So you don't have to pull down all the data from the entire record, right? If we just wanted the first name from our user, we can just pull that piece of data down rather than pulling the whole user object down, right? So the ability to fetch partial records is really cool. So again, think of CK operation as like, oh, you get the full power. There's a convenience API built on top of that lets you do the common things like in much less syntax in a quicker way. So think of like, hey, I just want to save our profile. So you're just saving it after you enter the stuff. Boom, you can use the convenience API for that because that's really simple, straightforward. In the convenience API, you can only do on like one record at a time. That's why I use the saving of the profile example, because we're just, anytime a user uses our app, they're saving the profile. That's one quick save, done. So think of the convenience API that we can use on top of that as, being pretty limited, but it can handle a lot of common stuff. And then if you need the full power, you go down to CK operation to do, again, batch updates, partial records, the quality of service, all of that kind of stuff. So again, CK operation is the workhorse. You're going to see us use this a ton. So if you're not quite sure about it now, you're going to get a lot of experience with it throughout the course. So that's the terminology and definitions to give you kind of like a baseline knowledge on how CloudKit works. If this was your first time hearing all these terms like records, containers, database, like I recommend watching this video again. It's probably not going to be that long. Watch it again, or after we start working with it, then come back and rewatch it, revisit this. At least that's what I found with my learning is I can watch all the WWDC videos, read all the blog posts I want until I touch it, until I play with it, until I get to use it. I don't fully understand it. So what I found, like even when I was, diving into CloudKit for this course, like, yeah, I did all the WWDC videos, I watched it, but once I built the project and then went back and watched those videos, they made so much more sense and really solidified it. So I highly, highly recommend revisiting this video after we've worked with it a little bit. All right, on to the next video.